So as you can see, it says PeerMark an experiment. So this may not necessarily be convincing you that PeerMark is the way to go, but I dived in last semester with PeerMark, and so I thought it would be useful to share some of those experiences. So this talk's based on experience in a second-year paramedicine unit that ran last semester. So just to give you a bit of a background, paramedicine came to Western Sydney University in 2014, so we're a brand new degree that has a lot of benefits when you're coming up with these kinds of things, because it means that there's no baggage, academic baggage, of previous people who say, no, it can't be done that way, or the things that we've heard from some of the other speakers. Some background on paramedicine in general. The paramedic. We are not a registered health profession, which may be a surprise to many of you, which means any of you prior to November last year could have called yourself a paramedic, completely legally. Currently we have protection of title, and that's about it. So we're not a registered profession, which means that we don't have a professional body, which means that any future learning after you finish the degree is entirely upon yourself. So there's that need to push and be driven in your continual professional development. Many of the state ambulance services, which are our primary employer, do have their own systems of continuing professional development, but most of them have actually come out and said it's inadequate. And so they've already, Victoria in particular, have said they're not training their paramedics or continuing to train their paramedics sufficiently, and New South Wales has similar issues. So again, we need to develop graduates that when they go out there aren't simply going to stagnate. You don't want the paramedic to come to you when you dial 000 that hasn't really looked at a book or can't remember what the heart exactly does. So for your point of view, we want them to have that motivation to continue to learn, to continue to reflect on their own training. The other thing is that you get a job with a state ambulance service. 12 months later, you're a fully qualified paramedic, and on that day, you can work with a brand new student. That's not in a supernumerary role, that's the two of you. So you've had 12 months experience, that person's got 1 day experience, you dial 000, and they're the two people who turn up. So that means that as well as being driven within themselves to continue their professional development, we need graduates who are very capable of providing feedback to their peers. Feedback that's constructive, that will allow that new student to develop and to continue to grow in their profession. So all of those kinds of things were in our mind when we came up with this great idea to use PeerMark and peer assessment. Now, part of that is for just general background information for you guys. The other part of it is to give you an idea that we had a very strong vision in mind of what we wanted to do. And the rest of the talk talks about how to do all of this and logistics and that. But probably the hardest part of it was convincing the students that this was something that was valuable to them, that this was something that was necessary for a graduate, that was necessary for a paramedic 10 years down the track, that this was something that was inherent within what we wanted them to leave this university with and to leave our course with. And so a lot of it was around the selling. And so probably if you're considering it, I would say be very clear in your reasoning, because there does need to be a lot of selling that goes on. I still need to do, clearly, a little bit more selling with some of our students and making that clear as to what's actually happening. And that's a lot easier in our course. It's essentially a vocational course that goes to a direct point, and might be a little bit harder in some of those broader degrees, such as health science, that has multiple pathways. So that was us. Our course then picks up on all of those things. Very brief overview, which you can kind of see up there. One of the key pillars of our degree is reflection. And so we start off getting the students to do reflections in first semester of first year. We do serial reflections. So they have to submit 3 in every semester. They get feedback on each one, all of those kinds of things. First year, as with most courses, you're focusing on skills, you're focusing on theory. Oops, wrong button, Liz. Moving on to second year. More skills, more theory, standard thing for a course. But also more advanced reflection. And at this point in first semester, we're starting to bring in the need to provide feedback in practical situations to peers. But feedback in a practical situation is a lot easier. It's a lot less threatening. Geez, you stuck that tube in the wrong hole. That's quite an easy thing to differentiate. It doesn't have the same personal component as maybe, geez, you've split your infinitive in that sentence, or some grammatical issue. So we started off doing oral peer feedback in a practical setting, which then brought us along to the end of second year, second semester, where we thought it was nice to situate a peer-reviewed assignment. So we used Turnitin for a number of reasons that we'll discuss a bit later on. But the assignment was a 4-part assignment. The joy with which the students received that was overwhelming. The first part was a 1,000-word literature review. And it was a choice for them. The unit covers cardiac, respiratory and neurological disorders and treatment and management, and they could choose absolutely any cardiac, respiratory or neurological illness that they came across, write a 1,000-word literature review. Understand that that is a very short word limit, and that was quite consciously done because they had to do a lot of other steps, and so the equivalent length was probably sort of the 2,000, 2,500. That initial submission is formative, and that proved to have a couple of issues, but generally went reasonably well. So they get time to do that. Then they have to review 2 other students' work, 2 other students' draft submissions. And that is provided to them through their Turnitin login, and that's provided anonymously. Part 3. They now themselves have 2 students, lots of feedback on their assignment, and so they get to incorporate that feedback into their own work, all formative so far, and then finally they submit the literature review for assessment, which is the only summative step out of the entire process. As I said, students looked at that and went, seriously, Liz, what are you expecting us to do? There seems to be an awful lot of work. So, very poor flowchart up there, the joys of making PowerPoints on a Mac. Sometimes they don't transfer to PCs. The first thing I did was make a flowchart for them. And what this flowchart identifies is a number of key points. Each of those 4 parts had an individual due date. So it wasn't, although it was formative, it wasn't just a free-form thing. You had to get that initial literature review in at date X. Then you had 2 weeks to provide feedback on those 2 reviews. Then you had another 2 weeks to incorporate that feedback into your own literature review, and then finally there was the submission. Now we had used Turnitin for pretty much most of our written assignments. All of our marking is done online, which was one of the reasons that we chose PeerMark over some other things. Students were very familiar with it. Having said that, they weren't familiar with PeerMark and what it would look like. And so part of this flowchart was trying to preempt the questions that would come and cut down my subsequent workload by giving them little screenshots in the flowchart as well. You log in on this week and it should look like this. If it doesn't, then call me. If it does, then go away and actually do the work. So you can see here that they get a little pop-up that says papers to review. It's quite simple. Hyperlink, start review, at which point they get an anonymous paper there. So this was the first time that we had ever done written peer feedback. And as with anything, although it's at the end of second year, we wanted to scaffold those skills, give them a bit of structure. We'd provided some resources to them. Bowd writes a really nice, very short, which is good for the sort of students actually reading it and taking it on board, article on how to provide peer feedback. Nice, good dot points throughout it. And so we discussed that. But we also then gave structure to their review so that they actually had to answer specific questions. Oops, I'll just scoot through to that, I'll come back. So the specific questions that they were asked: what's the best aspect of the paper in its current form? It was really important that we made the questions focus on the fact that this is a draft, that you're reviewing a draft. It essentially gives students that bit of an out to say, you're not slamming them, you're saying in this current form it needs these improvements. PeerMark is beautiful insofar as it allows you to set a minimum number of words. So they can't just write good, bad. The next one then, what aspects of the paper requires the most work? Again, nothing negative there, not saying what part of the paper was really lousy. So there's only 2 sections that have the free text. The other 3 are Likert scaled. Overall, what score would you give the paper out of 5? And then the last 2. For any of you who've given students a literature review, you would know that some of the issues that they have is they either don't use a good standard of literature, or alternately, they find great literature, but then they just lob it in the paper, and there's no sort of analysis or integration there. So we wanted to highlight that as something that the reviewers would look at and start to think, oh, that's what they're looking at when they're marking my paper. That's what the academics are thinking about, but also to give that feedback. So these 2 questions, how would you rate the use of literature to support the arguments, so actually applying it, and then how would you rate the choice of literature? And we found that very rarely did those 2 scores actually correlate with each other. So people were looking at that quite differently. Okay, so a couple of the issues that we found when setting up PeerMark. As probably you realised when Gina asked you all to show of hands of who'd done things, there was a huge lack of familiarity with it around the university. There is the SILT website that has the information there, but a lot of them are just the handbooks or the academic guides from Turnitin. And so there's an awful lot of video that you need to plough through. And it was really difficult if you had that question. I found that I was having to harass Narelle Oliver, who was the Turnitin consultant at the time, and then she'd have to go off to turn it in, and I was having a 5-day turnaround on all of my questions, which means that you need to be reasonably motivated to keep doing these things, and it also means that you need a long lag time prior to. The best piece of information I ever got was from my wonderful blended learning team, who told me to set up a sandpit site on Views. And so IT set up a blank site that only I had access to. They then gave me 5 fake students that I had the logins for, and I ran a mini semester. So I set up the assignments, then I went in as every single student and submitted 5 assessments. I went in as every single student and did 2 reviews on each, went in as every single student and resubmitted to see how it went. Again, needing some lag time here. Don't do it the day before semester starts. But from a personal perspective, I wanted to be able to stand up in front of the students and sell it to them, to say that this is a good thing, this is what you'll get out of it. And yes, there's a number of steps, but it's quite easy. You just click through here. You'll be able to go through everything. And if they came to me with a question, then hopefully I would have experienced it as I was going through. The other thing is that Turnitin isn't particularly intuitive in relation to PeerMark in what it calls the different types of assessments. So you have to set up final assessments and semi-final assessments, and there's a lot of odd terminology in there. Some other issues that we encountered: general logistics. 3 submission points required on views, so 1 for their initial submission, 1 for their review submission, 1 for their final submission. Again, as soon as you get 3 submission points, students start feeling less than positive. 3 due dates, and some of the feedback we got was, seriously, why am I having to do this 3 times? I'd set it up so that in between each of these blocks, I had a 2-day block out where the students had absolutely no access. And in that 2-day block out, I went in and checked that every single student had submitted. We had 88 students in the unit, so again, small cohort. But I checked that everyone had done it. You'd be familiar with Turnitin. It's not so arduous. You simply glance down and it gives you an overview. But it was really worthwhile because it meant that then I could fix any issues that were occurring without the students being disadvantaged. We've talked a lot about the selling. From the students' perspective, they said there were too many steps. Some of them also noted that the feedback that they were getting wasn't worthwhile, especially the higher academic achieving students. If they had lesser academic achieving students reviewing their work. So in future years, I think I need to probably highlight the fact that doing the reviews is just as worthwhile as the review information that you're getting. That you're seeing the questions that the academic is asking themselves, that you're reading other people's work and seeing that breadth of knowledge within the cohort, which is really important when we're providing feedback. If we go back to that ambulance crew with the person who was on their first day out and their person that was 12 months out, you want the feedback that's being given between those people to be reflective of all knowledge and all different types of paramedics and all different skill levels. So I still think it's worthwhile. We just needed to sell it a bit better. And there was some initial concern that they were doing an awful lot of work for no marks. However, it was good. There was some positives. As I said, we used this because we were already familiar with Turnitin. Students were familiar with Turnitin. 1 click, nothing outside of views. Fantastic. We were still able to do online marking, and I mentioned that all of ours is done online. And then we had the opportunities to customise. So PeerMark provides a lot of those opportunities. We set it up to be anonymous feedback, but you can also do it where you actually know who you're giving feedback to. You can set it so that there are marks allocated to the feedback, or that feedback influences the final grade. We had it so that none of those were affected. They were all compulsory hurdles, but the only mark was the academics mark at the end. So if you got poor feedback, that wasn't affecting you. Very much a formative setting. You can also ask them to do a self-review, and I'm considering that for this year, so that they can actually do that direct comparison between their own work and others. And finally, if you've got students who are on AIPs or need extensions or any of those kinds of things, you can physically take students out, or you can manually pair up your students, which gives an awful lot of ease and flexibility. So just to have a bit of a look at it, this is the final view that you get. So you can see that the student submitted 2 reviews and received 2 reviews. And you as the academic can see whose work they reviewed and who reviewed their work. And then you can jump in and review each of them. The visual that you get is their assignment on one side and their comments down the other. And these are just a couple of the things that we were actually getting back. These are all student feedback. And they were comments that I would have been very happy for any of our casual academics to provide, or for me to have provided. Comments like academic language should be revisited. Not a negative comment, just a highlight. Interesting subject matter, clear structural approach when has been made. Strong sources were used. Despite the use of websites as references, they're professional organisations that are credible. So they're actually thinking through the comments that they're making. And this last section here, as I mentioned with the literature, so both of those come from the one assignment. Obviously, they're thinking that the choice of literature that they had was really high, but they just hadn't integrated it well. And so that's being sent as a very clear message to that student. And they're the sorts of things that move an assignment from a pass or a credit to a distinction or a high distinction. So clearly highlighted there. Yeah. Mainly because I went to all the effort to set it up the first time, so I want to at least give it one more go. I'm still wedded to that thing that it was great formative feedback. I see this as being such an important component of the students' learning and something that's so integral to what we want our graduates to have at the end. So we're going to try it again. Generally, they thought it was good. Some SFU comments. A lot of comments around some of the initial submissions appeared to be essentially like a first draft. And because it's not being marked, that needs to be better controlled by the academics to say that, no, you need to be putting in essentially what can be reviewed. Some lovely comments around it being insightful to see what other students have done. One student came up to me and she said, I love this because I've always been so protective of my work due to plagiarism and collusion concerns that this is the first time I've been able to see the standard of other students. And I've really learned a lot from that. And I think it was, although a lot of the comments in the SFUs were negative, I did note that assessment feedback, which tends to be, at most of the universities I've worked at, reasonably poorly responded to, and our school average last year was 3.8. Our response for that was 4.4 for assessment feedback. So they were clearly seeing that they were getting feedback. Tips, if you want to go there, start now. It does take time to set up. And it takes time to sort of get your head around. The sandpit site was a complete boon. It made my life so much easier, and it meant that I could confidently answer questions from students. Work out all of your dates and have that block out in between because it gives you the buffer for when all hell breaks loose. Other things that we discovered, lots of students will put their name in the header or the footer of the assignment, which means that then you can see it, so the anonymity goes out the window. Just a reminder to them not to do that. Don't put the papers in the repository when you're clicking those options on Turn It In, because otherwise it matches to their assignment and the subsequent Turn It In report is scary and red and the students stress. There are some resources available, as I mentioned, on the website. But if anyone is keen to go ahead with it, there are a lot of benefits, so feel free to get in touch. Any questions? Later. No, and it was something that we were concerned about, and we have had plagiarism in other instances, but there was no one was pulled up on plagiarism for this assignment. I think the fact that they all got to choose a different topic, or many of them chose different topics, often the things that they were reviewing may not even have related to them. They might have been doing cardiac and these were respiratory. So I think that cut down on that a little bit. Ah, hello. Yes. Fantastic. And Narelle was great. She answered so many questions, and apparently Turnitin's now got an office in Melbourne, which meant that our turnaround time was a bit better, so it was good.
I've also got a view site that I've put together. We can work on that, reopening that up.
The whole thing of courageous minister comes to mind. I think the fact that, as I mentioned, we are a new course. We don't have, this is the first cohort that had come through that I'd done this with, as in the first paramedicine course cohort. And they're very used to being guinea pigs. Quite seriously, we've changed a lot of things on them. We also have so we have flipped classroom, we have skills videos. We're quite blended in our presentation. They have to do video assignments, all of those kinds of things. They just saw it as another one of those things that they're doing. So I definitely agree that you could get a lot of kickback, but I think we're just in that fortunate position that they're already used to us. No, there's pretty much no accreditation. Well, our course is accredited by the Council of Ambulance Authorities, but that is a voluntary thing. We have applied again to APRA, and we're hoping to be a registered profession by September 2018. But we have no either for the profession nor for education. Oh, in other countries, yes, South Africa is accredited, UK, New Zealand, sections of Canada, all have accreditation.
Thank you so much, Liz. So just to wrap up, I'd really like to thank Simon, Irina, Graham and Liz for presenting today, and I hope you'll join us in continuing the conversation around assessment. Up the stairs and outside we've got some coffee, tea and biscuits available. Would you like to be a presenter at our next forum? We're always looking for people to present and share their experiences, or do you know someone else that you would like to nominate, we'll say. Please contact Hermie or myself. Our next Designing for Learning forum, I should say, is on Thursday the 2nd of June at Bankstown campus. So we'll watch out for our comms for that, and we hope you'll come along and join us for that as well. So thank you very, very much, and we'll continue talking to you outside and up the stairs.